My name is Vivienne Hartley. I am 33 and I own a 5-bedroom villa on the coast of Portugal, 20 minutes outside Lagos, with a private path down to the beach and a terrace where I watch the sun drop into the Atlantic most evenings after work. I built the design studio that paid for it from a single laptop in a rented room in Bristol over 9 years without a single pound of help from my family. "You're just wasting space here," my mother said to me standing in my own kitchen, looking around at the home I'd built as though she were appraising it for a fire sale. She said it the week before my cousin's engagement party, the one she wanted to host at my villa without asking me first. She said it like a woman entitled to an opinion about a house she'd never once offered to help pay for. She had no idea that 3 days later she would drive past that same villa in a hired car, assuming I no longer lived there, and find out exactly how wrong she'd been. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever built something with your own hands only to have your family act like it belongs to them too, this story is for you. Drop a comment and subscribe. It helps more than you know. Let me take you back to where this really started, because you need to understand the family I came from before you understand why my mother thought she had the right to walk into my home and call it wasted space. I grew up in Chesterfield, in a semi-detached house with thin walls and a mother who measured every achievement by how it reflected on her at the school gates. My father, Alan, worked as an insurance loss adjuster for 26 years. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man who agreed with whatever kept dinner peaceful. My mother, Denise, ran our family the way she ran her book club, with opinions delivered as facts and facts that always somehow benefited her preferred narrative. My younger brother, Oliver, was the one she built her identity around. Captain of the school football team, later a moderately successful car dealership manager, the son she introduced to everyone within 30 seconds of meeting them. I was the daughter who did well in school and kept her opinions to herself, because I'd learned by the age of 10 that disagreeing with my mother in public cost more than it was worth. When I turned 22, I moved to Bristol to study graphic design against my mother's wishes. She wanted me to take an administrative role at the insurance firm where my father worked, something stable, something she could explain easily to her friends. Instead, I built a design studio from nothing, working nights and weekends for years, taking on every client who would pay, until eventually I didn't need to take on every client anymore. I bought the villa in Portugal 4 years ago outright, with money I'd earned and saved myself. I thought, foolishly, that it might finally earn me something from my mother besides silence or criticism. Instead, it earned me an entirely new kind of attention, the kind that only appears once you have something worth taking. The one person in my family who never once asked what the villa cost was my Aunt Rosalind, my father's older sister who had lived in Portugal herself for almost 15 years, running a small pottery studio in a village outside Faro. Rosalind visited me twice a year, always announced, always with a bottle of good Vinho Verde and absolutely no interest in touring the property like an estate agent. She would sit on my terrace, watch the water, and ask if I was sleeping properly and whether the studio was keeping me too busy to enjoy the life I'd built. Rosalind had left England in her late 30s, after a marriage that hadn't worked and a family that hadn't particularly noticed she'd gone. She built her pottery business slowly, the way I'd built my studio, and she understood better than anyone what it meant to create something out of nothing, and then watch people who'd never lifted a finger for it decide they had a claim to it anyway. "Your mother," Rosalind told me once over a glass of wine on my terrace, "has never once asked me what my life in Portugal is actually like. She's only ever asked what the house is worth." She said it without bitterness, the way you state a fact you've long since made peace with. My cousin Freya, Oliver's daughter from his first marriage, got engaged in the spring to a man named Marcus who worked in shipping logistics out of Southampton. The engagement announcement itself was modest, a small gathering at my parents' house with Prosecco and a few close friends. But within weeks, my mother had decided the actual celebration needed to be something grander, something that reflected well on the family and specifically on her. I found out about her plans the way I found out about most things involving my mother. Secondhand, through Oliver, delivered as though it were already settled. "Mum wants to do Freya's engagement party at your place in Portugal," Oliver said over the phone, his tone suggesting this was simply logistics to be worked out, not a request that required my actual consent. "She's been telling everyone about the villa for months. Thinks it would make a brilliant backdrop for photos. I told him carefully that I hadn't been asked and that a beachfront celebration for 40 or 50 guests wasn't something I could simply agree to on my mother's behalf without even a conversation first. There was a pause, and then Oliver said something that should have warned me exactly how far my mother intended to take this. You know how she gets when she's decided something, Viv. She's already looked at flights. I should have called her immediately and put a stop to it. I didn't. I told myself it was just Oliver relaying an idea that hadn't been confirmed yet, and went back to my client work, hoping the whole thing would quietly resolve itself. It did not. I found out exactly how far my mother had taken things 2 weeks later, when she called me on a Sunday evening, her voice bright in that particular way she used when she'd already made a decision and simply hadn't informed me of it yet. Vivienne, I've booked flights for the family for the third weekend of next month. Freya's engagement party, we'll do it on your terrace, obviously. The view is far too good to waste on just you, sitting there by yourself every evening. I set my tea down very carefully. Mum, you haven't asked me if that weekend works or if I'm even comfortable hosting 50 people in my home. Don't be difficult, Vivienne. It's family. And honestly, it's not like you're using the space for anything. You're just wasting it, sitting there alone with all those empty bedrooms. It would be nice for the house to actually be useful for once. Wasting space. As though the home I'd built with 9 years of 80-hour weeks was an underused asset waiting for someone in my family to finally put it to good use. I told her I needed to think about it, which was, in hindsight, my first mistake. Because in my mother's world, needing to think about something was simply the polite version of not yet having said yes, and not yet having said yes meant the conversation would continue until I did. Over the following 2 weeks, the pressure arrived in familiar shapes. My father left a voicemail suggesting it would mean the world to your mother if I agreed. Oliver texted a spreadsheet, an actual spreadsheet, outlining catering costs he assumed I'd be covering alongside hosting, since I clearly had the means. My mother mentioned to her sister within my hearing on a group call that Vivienne's always been generous when it really counts. I hadn't said yes, I also hadn't said no because some quiet, watchful part of me, the same part that reviews every client contract twice before signing, wanted to see exactly how far this would go before I closed the door on it publicly. I called Rosalind that evening. They want to use the villa for Freya's party. Mum's already booked flights. She told me I'm wasting the space. There was a long pause, and then Rosalind said something I haven't forgotten since. Vivienne, darling, your mother has never once valued anything she couldn't take credit for in front of other people. Don't say yes, but don't say no just yet either. Let her show everyone exactly who she is first. People like your mother always do, if you give them enough rope to work with. I didn't fully understand what she meant until 3 days later, when my mother, assuming I'd already quietly agreed to everything, hired a car from the airport and drove past the villa with my aunt's neighbor, Fernanda, giving her a preview tour before I'd said a single confirmed word, only to be met with something she never expected waiting for her at the gate. Fernanda, Rosalind's neighbor, ran a small property management business in the village, helping foreign owners with everything from pool maintenance to arranging cleaners between visits. My mother had apparently found her number through Rosalind months earlier, for reasons she'd never bothered to explain, and had been quietly emailing her about preparing the villa for the engagement party for weeks before I'd agreed to any of it. I only learned this because Fernanda called me directly, confused, the Thursday before the supposed party weekend. Vivienne, I don't want to overstep, but your mother has asked me twice now about arranging extra chairs and a caterer for the terrace this weekend. I told her I'd need to confirm with you directly since my agreement is with you, not with her. Is this something you've approved? I hadn't approved anything. I hadn't even confirmed a date. My mother had simply decided the party was happening, told everyone it was settled, and started arranging logistics with a woman she'd found through my aunt, entirely bypassing me, as though I were an amenity attached to the property rather than the person who owned it. I told Fernanda, clearly and calmly, that no arrangements should be made, that the villa was not confirmed for any event, and that any future requests needed to come through me directly. She apologized, relieved, and said she'd suspected as much given how the requests had been phrased. Never would Vivienne be happy to. Always, we've decided, we're doing, we need. I called my mother that evening to finally put an end to it. She didn't answer. She rarely did when she suspected I might say something she didn't want to hear. 2 days later, on the Saturday the party was supposedly happening, I was on my terrace with my laptop finishing a client presentation when I heard a car slow down on the coastal road below the property. I looked up and saw a hired car pull alongside the low stone wall at the edge of my land, and my mother step out, along with my father, Oliver, and Freya, all dressed for a celebration nobody had actually confirmed was taking place. My mother stood at the gate, looking up at the villa, phone already out to take photographs, clearly expecting to walk in and find caterers setting up chairs on the terrace she'd been arranging without me for weeks. Instead, she found the gate locked, a small wrought iron latch she'd never once had to use because I'd always been the one to open it for her every single time she'd visited before. And standing just inside it, having arrived an hour earlier, specifically because I'd told her something felt wrong about the way this whole weekend had been arranged, was Rosalind, arms folded, wearing the same calm, unhurried expression she wore whenever she was about to say something my mother had spent years hoping she never would. "Denise," Rosalind said before my mother could speak, "I think it's time you heard exactly what I told Vivienne 3 weeks ago, and exactly why this party was never happening the way you thought it was." My mother's phone lowered slightly, the photograph she'd been about to take forgotten. Behind her, my father shifted his weight, and Oliver glanced at Freya with the particular discomfort of a man realizing a celebration he'd assumed was settled might not be happening at all. "Rosalind, this isn't your business," my mother said, though her voice had already lost some of its usual certainty. "It became my business the moment you used my neighbor to arrange a party in my niece's home without ever asking her properly." Rosalind's tone stayed level, the same tone she used discussing glaze temperatures in her pottery studio. "So let me tell you exactly what's happened here in front of everyone, since you seem to prefer having these conversations with an audience." She turned slightly so my father and Oliver could hear without strain. 3 weeks ago, Vivienne told me you'd called her house wasted space while asking to use it for free. I told her not to say yes and not to say no either. To let you show everyone exactly who you are first, because I've watched you do this to her for 15 years, Denise. Every visit, every phone call, always the same question. Not how is she? Not is she happy? Only what is the house worth and how can we use it? My mother's face had gone the color of the whitewashed wall behind her. "I left England 15 years ago because nobody in this family valued anything I built, unless they could stand in it themselves and take a photograph. I watched you do it to Vivienne with her studio, and I watched you do it again with this villa. You didn't fly out here for Freya's engagement. You flew out here because you'd already told your friends back home about the beachfront party at your daughter's house, and you needed it to be real." Freya, standing quietly beside her father, looked between my mother and Rosalind with an expression I recognized immediately. The same one I'd worn for years, the slow realization that the adults around you have been performing a version of family that never actually included you as a person, only as a backdrop. "Grandma," Freya said quietly, "did you actually ask Vivienne if this was okay?" My mother didn't answer. I walked out onto the terrace then, down toward the gate, and unlatched it myself. My mother's shoulders relaxed slightly, assuming, I think, that this meant everything was back on track. "You can come in," I said, "as my family for a cup of tea, not for a party I never agreed to, hosted by a woman I hired without my permission, in a house you called wasted space 3 weeks ago." I looked at her directly. "The villa isn't a venue, Mum. It's my home, and you don't get to decide what it's for." My mother didn't have a response ready, which I don't think had happened to her in a very long time. My father looked at the ground. Oliver quietly suggested they find a restaurant in town for lunch instead. And for once, nobody argued with him. They left an hour later, subdued, Freya hugging me tightly at the gate and whispering, "I'm sorry, I didn't know it was like this." I told her it wasn't her fault and that I hoped whatever she built one day, nobody in her family would ever call it wasted. My mother called a week later. She didn't apologize directly, but she asked, for the first time in years, how the studio was actually going and whether I was happy. It wasn't everything, but it was something I hadn't heard from her before. Rosalind still visits twice a year, always announced, always with good wine, and never once asking what the house is worth. That's my story. One locked gate, one aunt who'd waited 15 years to say what needed saying, and a house that was never wasted at all. If you've ever built something with your own hands only to be told it wasn't enough, or that it belonged to everyone but you, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.